I'm John Martin, as Donald said. A little bit about myself. I'm the head of the Climate Engagement and Governance Division at the Department of Transport. I've been there since about May of last year, so fairly new in the role. And it's been a very steep learning curve. Prior to that, I worked in the area of flood risk management and flood relief in the OPW for about 18 years. And prior to that, I did a PhD in UCC with Professor Philip O'Kane, who I'm very honoured to have in the audience this evening. So it's great to have you here, Philip. So yes, I am going to talk about the transport elements of the Climate Action Plan 2023. Before I start, I don't know if anyone online or in the room has read the chapter. It's quite a long chapter. But anyone who's read it will look at it and think, wow, this is high levels of ambition. This is big, and it is. The targets we're setting ourselves in CAP23, particularly from a transport perspective, are, to coin a term someone else used recently, eye-watering. And they really are. And for me, it's not a sort of binary thing of will we succeed or not. If we get almost all the way there, or even 70% of the way there, we have achieved something. But one thing is certain, we have to change. You have to change our system. You have to change our transport system. And that's what this is about. Set the bar high and then really, really work to try and achieve it. So why is this not going forward for me? It is. CAP23. A couple of things to say about the Climate Action Plan generally in the round before I get into the transport elements of it. The Climate Action Plan 23 was published on the 21st of December 2022. The reason it's called CAP23 when the one that was published 12 months previously was called CAP21 is because, to be honest, it came out just before the end of the year. So to call it CAP22, it would have been out of date in 9 days' time. So we said, right, we'll just rename the whole thing CAP23, see it as a rolling program of annual updates to our climate action plans. So obviously the one that we published just before the end of this year will be CAP24. What sets this climate action plan apart from the previous climate action plans we've seen is that halfway through the year last year, a certain number of sectors, 6 sectors, had sectoral emission ceilings applied to them, which means we set in law the total amount of emissions that were allowable out to 2025 and out to 2030. I'll come back to the specifics on that, but they were defined in law. So what we're talking about now is statutory, legally binding climate emission targets. And this was the first climate action plan to actually implement the measures required to achieve those. So to set out the policies and the pathways required to achieve those statutory binding limits. So it sets out a roadmap for decisive actions to halve our emissions by 2030 and to be climate neutral or net zero by 2050. Now, the Climate Action Plan, as I said, was published just before Christmas. It is to be followed in a couple of weeks, hopefully 2 or 3 weeks, by a fairly high-level Annex of Actions across all sectors. So there will be an Annex of Actions setting out the steps that each sector has to take over the coming year and years beyond that to achieve these targets. So as I say, the CAP23 is the first climate action plan prepared that is pursuant to Section 6 of the Climate Act. In other words, it's the first climate action plan that's been developed that is legally binding. So what's in the plan has to comply with the law, and we have to comply with the targets we set out in the plan. So it gives the whole thing a statutory footing, which from my perspective and other department leads who are trying to deliver this makes the whole thing very real. And to be honest, quite scary, but we've got to do it. So the Climate Action Plan, it's a fairly bulky document. It's about 285 pages long. It's got 22 chapters, but for me, what's key is that it has, it's identified 6 vital high impact sectors, and they are energy generation, buildings, transport, agriculture, business, and land use change, and forestry. And for those 6 chapters, or for those 6 sectors, they've set these sectoral emission ceilings. And this gives you an example here of what I mean by that. So in the blue column on the left-hand side, we have the actual observed emissions from each of the sectors in our baseline, which is 2018. Okay, so you can see transport, which is highlighted in red there, the second row down. Our transport emissions in 2018 were 12 megatons of CO2 equivalent, in this case CO2. The orange boxes tell us our cumulative sectoral emission ceilings for carbon budget period 1, which goes 21 to 25, and for carbon budget period 2, which is 26 to 30. So for our carbon budget period 1, that 5-year period, we are limited to a ceiling of 54 megatons of CO2 equivalent. And for the following 6-year period, we're limited to 37 megatons of CO2 equivalent. To reiterate, that's a 5-year cumulative figure. Okay, it's not an annual landing point. The figures you see in green are the annual landing points. So by 2025, we want to be landing at about 10 megatons per year, which represents a 20% reduction in our emissions from the 2018 baseline. And by 2030, we want to be down at 6 megatons CO2 equivalent per year, which represents a 50% reduction. If I just jump back up again, you'll see that other sectors have different targets applied to them. Transport has a 50%, in green there, has a 50% reduction, whereas other sectors, energy generation, for example, has a 75% reduction, which is huge. So I'm glad I moved to the Department of Transport rather than the Department of Environment, Communication and Climate. So to home in specifically on transport, as I said, the transport chapter of the Climate Action Plan, it sets out the measures, the specific measures that are required for the first carbon budget period, which is 21 to 25, over which we have a ceiling of 54 megatons CO2 equivalent. It also then, at a slightly lesser level of detail, sets out the policies and measures for the second budget period, which is 26 to 30. But looking back at the first carbon budget period, you can see there that our 2021 emissions were 10.9 megatons. Okay, so that's 20.2% of our overall 5-year cumulative allowance, which means that we're already, we're already slightly not on the back foot, but we've already got very, very tight margins of error. So what I'm showing on this slide here is the indicative carbonisation pathway for the transport sector, which is consistent with the figures I've referred to. So for the first 5 years, we've got a trajectory bringing us down to a 20% reduction. And then the second 5 years, we've got a trajectory that brings us all the way down to our 50% reduction. Now, if you look at the red dots, they are our actual emissions. So 2018 is what it is. Then the second column along is 2021. Now you can see that we're below the trajectory there, and you think, yay, our trajectory is good. We're actually ahead of the curve. But then remember back to 2021, no one was going anywhere. We were in the middle of the COVID-19 lockdown. No one was moving around. So that downward trajectory you see on those 2 red dots, forget about that, because that's gone back up now. And we've seen that through indicative modeling that we're getting from the SEAI, in that our 2022 projections are likely to be back up over 11 megatons, okay? Which will still have us pretty much on track as long as after 2022, we start dipping down again. And that's a big if. That's a really, really big if. So we do really need to put our shoulders to the wheel and start implementing all of the things that we say we're going to do in the plan, but also make sure they have an impact, and also make sure that they really start delivering on these abatements that we need to. So how are we approaching this in terms of the transport chapter of the Climate Action Plan 23? During the year, back in October, the OECD published a report called Redesigning Ireland's Transport for Net Zero. This was a report that was commissioned by the Climate Change Advisory Council. And basically what this does is it looks at Ireland's transport system, not only purely through a carbon lens, but also through a broader well-being lens. And it says, okay, how can we fix the transport system in a way that delivers the carbon abatement targets or ambitions that we want to deliver, but also just fixes a system that doesn't really work for everybody. And it was a very long report. It was about 200 pages, but it really recognized the need for a systemic change and measures with high transformative potential. So it recommended, really strong communications so that we can explain to all of society the sorts of changes that are needed. It recommended things like road space reallocation, where we're taking space away from cars to try and fit the priorities, particularly in an urban area, from car parking spaces and 3 and 4 lanes of traffic in cities down to more livable, people-oriented cities. And it recommended things like on-demand shared services, where rather than having to own a bike or a car or whatever it may be, you can access shared cars or shared bikes as and when you need to. But what was really important about the work that the OECD did was it said you need to rethink everything. Don't tinker around the edges. Don't say we'll replace all our fossil fuel cars with EVs and we've solved the carbon issue. Look at the whole thing as a system. And think about how you can change the system that drives how we move around rather than just changing the mode by which you move around. So, sorry, I skipped. So with that in mind, there is a well-established theory in transport theory or practice of avoid, shift, improve. And what this means is, first of all, avoid means developing our services, developing our communities and our infrastructure in such a way as to avoid the need to travel as much as we do today. So that means making our cities more accessible by foot, 15-minute cities, increased accessibility, so that people don't need to move around by car all the time. They can walk, they have the services they need around them. And that brings in that really strong link between spatial planning and strategic transport planning and the development of our transport policies. So the first thing is, can we reduce how much society needs to move around? Not constrain it. We had enough of constraining people moving around during COVID, but just give people the services on their doorstep so they don't need to get into the car to drive 20 minutes to go to a GP or whatever they need to do, so that they have everything around them, so that when they travel, they do so by choice and not out of necessity. The second then is shift, which is improving the relative attractiveness of sustainable modes. So what that means is two things: making sustainable modes more attractive, public transport better, cheaper, cleaner, safer, more efficient, more reliable, making active travel such as cycling or walking or wheeling safer and easier for people to choose to do, but also later on and down the road, looking at measures that can make car use less attractive. And I'll come back to that in a second, but there is this balance. By doing one, you can actually achieve the other. So road space reallocation, for example, if you allocate more space to bus lanes, for example, you have a much better bus system, but you also have a much less attractive car system. So you're achieving the same thing through one single measure. So that's shift. And the third thing is complement those measures by improving the residual or leftover car fleet. So that's things like biofuels, that's things like electrification, but that's very much the third step in the hierarchy. So in terms of how we develop the chapter, before I get into the measure, the chapter was developed in our thinking in the Department of Transport over a long period of time, over 6 or 7 months, with a number of different working groups and workshops and so on with stakeholders. Then we had 3 meetings of a transport working group, which was chaired by the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications, and then lots of bilateral engagements building on what we call our gap to target workshops. And I'll talk about the gap to target piece of work in a minute. But these workshops that we held during the summer with a whole range of stakeholders. We had lots of engagement with other departments, be it Environment, Climate and Communications, Department of Taoiseach, Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and other stakeholders. But a key driver for the development of the chapter was what we call our gap to target modelling. So in CAP 21, which was the climate action plan from just over a year ago, there was an action in there for modelling to identify measures to achieve a gap that we had identified. So when we developed CAP 21, we did our modeling and we said we're still short of closing that gap that we need to close. So we commissioned an extensive recalibration and review of our full modeling in order to be able to close that gap. And that full modeling approach that we undertook, which was very extensive, and I'm not going to pretend to understand it all, but that basically redefined the pathways that we needed to follow in order to achieve our pathway to 50% reduction by 2030 and 100% reduction by 2050. And that modeling work is, that was undertaken by the NTA, the National Transport Authority, and Sistra and Jacobs, and the publication of all that work has taken place. So if anyone really wants to get into the nuts and bolts of the modeling, they can do so on the NTA website. Just to give you a quick overview as to how the modeling worked. So this was basically a whole suite of fleet models, national household travel survey models, regional modeling system models, all talking to each other. So we had our regional modeling system on the left-hand side, by which we could play around with different games. So first of all, look at what the demographic growth under a business as usual scenario would give us in terms of emissions. So if we did nothing and just allowed the country to grow it as it is and will continue to, but not intervene from a transport perspective, what carbon emissions would we see by 2030? And then look at including all the other interventions such as increased or enhanced public transport, demand management measures, increased active travel, a whole suite of measures. We were able to test all these different things out and input them into what we call a carbon footprinting tool. On the other side there, on the right-hand side, then there were other models that we used, and we were able to make assumptions around things like EV uptake, penetration of biofuels into the system, et cetera, and basically carbon footprint all these different interventions and see what each of the individual interventions would give us in terms of abatement. And we got a pathway that looked like this. So on the far left-hand side of that graph, you can see our baseline emissions from 2012. The different colors represent different sectors: heavy-duty vehicles, light-duty vehicles, private car, et cetera, et cetera. So the first stack on the column is 2018, our reference case. The second one along is what our emissions would be by 2030 if we just did nothing. So what we would see, owing solely to demographic growth, would be an increase in our annual carbon emissions from approximately 12 megatons CO2 equivalent per annum, right up to 14 or just in excess of 14. The third one is what happens when you start replacing the fleet with EVs. Okay, and I already said that EVs aren't the only answer here, but it is clear that the drop by the implementation of an EV strategy, be it in terms of getting more cars on the road and facilitating them through charging infrastructure, is significant. The fourth one then is the further drop by introducing higher rates of biofuels. The fifth one is looking at the impact of speed limits, which is, as you can see, they're negligible. And the sixth one is that final push to drive behavioral change, to get people out of their cars, to travel less, get them onto public transport, onto active travel, create systems and services so that people don't need to move around as much. So you can see there that footprinting tool where we've looked at the impact of these different interventions at driving down our emissions by 2030. So it was that work that really informed our pathway that's included in the Climate Action Plan 2023. I'll reiterate, given that I'm about halfway through, that the measures and the targets we've set ourselves are pretty eye-watering. This is a pathway. What Climate Action Plan 2023 is required to do is set out the measures that would be required for us to achieve the carbon reduction targets that we've set ourselves. So this is big stuff. In terms of the vision or the matrices and what we're looking to achieve, slightly clunky graph here, but you only need to focus on the text on the left-hand side of the screen. The text on the right is just the screen grab from the plan itself. And it sets out a couple of the high-level metrics that we've set ourselves for for 2030. So the things that we want to achieve in order to deliver the carbon reduction that we've set ourselves. And I'll present that slightly differently in the next slide. So first of all, we're looking to reduce the number of vehicle kilometers driven by 2030 by 20%. That means we want people to be driving, whether it's fossil fuel cars or EVs, we want the total kilometerage, if that's a word, of cars driven to be 20% less than it would have been under a business as usual scenario. The second thing is we want to shift and drive down the modal share of cars. So currently about 3/4 of all our journeys are taken by car, and a lot of those journeys are very short journeys. They're less than 2 kilometers. So what we want to do is drive down the modal share of car journeys and transfer them over to public transport journeys or active travel journeys, be it walking, wheeling, cycling, whatever. So that effectively what we'd arrive at by 2030 is 1 in every 2 journeys being taken in the country being a sustainable journey. Third thing, and one of the key areas that we're looking to target is in escort education. So basically parents driving their kids to school. We want to try and drive down the number of car journeys used for escorting children to school by 30%. So that can mean one of 2 things. You either bring your kids by walking or by cycling, or they cycle or walk themselves, for example, through cycle buses, which we're seeing spring up all over the place, or they take public transport, or you escort them on public transport, whatever, doesn't matter, but we just want 30% less car journeys arriving at our schools. And one of the key enablers of this, and I see Cynthia there, is the Safe Routes to Schools program, where we are looking at making the fronts of our schools much more conducive to people arriving by foot or by bike, and less conducive to people arriving by cars. The fourth thing I have there is the EV proportion, and we're looking for 30% of all our cars on the road by 2030 to be electric. Now, this is a different way of presenting the same number that was in CAP 21. It amounts to about 850 EVs to be on the road by 2030. Could we go higher? Potentially, but there are a number of issues there. One is supply chain. We just aren't getting the cars into the country quickly enough, whereas the target we have set ourselves, we are on target or on track to meet that target. But secondly, if you go back to the OECD report, remember what I was saying about trying to change this car-centric system we have. So by just flooding the market with brand new EVs isn't going to solve that problem. So we have set that trajectory of 30%. We want at least 30% of our fleet to be electric by 2030. And then in terms of biofuels, that's one relatively easy and quick way of reducing our carbon emissions. You just increase the volume of biofuels. So when you tank your car, you don't even have to do anything. You don't have to change your behavior. You tank as you always did, but the amount of biofuels in what you're putting in your car is increased, and therefore your emissions are slightly less. So moving on to the actions. As I said, one of the key takeaways, whether we had written it this way or not is debatable, but one of the key takeaways from CAP 21 is we need to get 1 million EVs on the road. That was the action. That was what people took away. That's what CAP 21 meant to a lot of people. Whereas we really wanted to look and focus at our actions for CAP 23 much around this avoid, shift, improve mantra. So it's not just about getting more EVs on the road. It's so much more than that. And as I said already, all the actions will have a very strong recognition of the recommendations in the OECD report. So there's a whole suite of actions set out in the Climate Action Plan for transport. The sort of high level or cross-cutting ones, though, are very important. Communications is going to be absolutely key for all this. Communicating to society that we need to rethink our transport systems. We need to rethink how we move around. We need to rethink every choice we make to get into a car, and then could I do this differently? Do I need to make this journey? And if I do, is there a different way of doing it other than getting into the car? So communications around choice of mode, around the availability of alternatives, be it public transport or active travel, or indeed promoting the uptake of EVs will be absolutely key across this. Just getting the message out, what we're trying to achieve, why we're trying to achieve it, and what the other benefits of that will be. The second thing is accelerating implementation. And Minister Eamon Ryan, every time you hear him speaking about this, he's talking about doing it quicker, increasing the pace at which we roll out all of this stuff. In Ireland, we can be quite slow at implementing major projects, major infrastructure projects, and we need to identify things that we can do quickly and ways that we can do everything else more quickly. And we need to keep that focus of quick delivery. Time is of the essence. And the third is enhanced governance. And this effectively just means joined up thinking, bringing everyone into the room, be it spatial planners, land use planners, transport planners, so that we're all working together and feeding off each other and doing things together rather than in isolation, and making sure that we're all accountable to the same objectives. So they're the cross-cutting measures. And then we've divided the other measures, which I'll run through fairly quickly now, under avoid. There's a few that we couldn't really figure out, are they avoid or are they shift? So we've called them avoid plus shift, and then shift, and then improve. So first of all, the avoid ones, which are developing services, communities, and infrastructure in such a way as to avoid the need to travel as much as we do today. And I've got a graphic on the right-hand side there. It's a very well-known graphic demonstrating the concept of a 15-minute city, where everything you need is accessible. The urban space is designed for you to be able to move around easily and freely, and all the services you required are within reach and distance without having to get into a car. So the first set of avoid measures is enhanced spatial and land use planning. And this requires joined up thinking between our land use planning, our spatial planning, and our transport planning. And it includes a whole range of things: stronger consideration of transport-orientated development, sustainable and compact settlement guidelines, which the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage are working on, but we need to work with them and support them and make sure they can achieve something meaningful to reduce the amount that people need to travel. Updated transport appraisal guidelines. And then I've included the DMARS, which is the Design Manual for Urban Roads and Streets. And the reason that's relevant is if we design our cities and our roads and streets so that everyone can use them and get around and you don't have to get into a car, then more people are going to actually realize that actually it's really easy to get there without having to drive. I can just walk. And the streets, the roads, and the infrastructure is designed in such a way for people to walk easily. The second thing under the avoid category then is strategic transport planning. So the first thing we really need to do is expand the remit of the NTA to include strategic transport planning in the other regional cities. Currently, the NTA only has a remit for strategic planning for Dublin, and that has to be rolled out to the other cities. And then continue to update really strongly thought out and strongly developed metropolitan area transport strategies, or MATS as they're called. So you may have heard recently that the Greater Dublin Area Transportation Strategy, which is the Dublin MATS effectively, was published. We need to keep updating all of our 5 cities' transport strategies and make sure that they are really focused on sustainable mobility rather than car-centric. And then strategic network planning, be it our road network or our public transport network, is key. Moving on to avoid and shift, first of all, a demand management strategy. And demand management is a term that when I joined the department, I couldn't really figure out what it meant. But what it means is effectively ways of encouraging and incentivizing people to get out of their cars. It's as simple as that. So be that through fiscal measures, be it through reduction in parking, be it through road space reallocation, or be it through really promoting the benefits of the alternative. We have to come up with a national demand management strategy, which is basically our policy approach to disincentivizing car use in favor of other more sustainable modes. So one of the actions there is that by the end of this year, we will have published a national demand management strategy. There's also other things in terms of speed management and enforcement, and promoting uptake of blended working policies, because the more blended working we do, or working at home, or remote working, working from anywhere, the less people need to use their cars. So that is a demand management strategy in itself. Then road space reallocation is a key thing. And I think in Ireland, we're really starting to see this, certainly in Dublin City, but also in other areas. Cork City did amazing work on this during the pandemic and then made it stick afterwards, where they pedestrianised 17 different streets in the urban centre on the island in Cork. So what this means is very simple. Take space away from cars. Take parking spaces away and take carriageway spaces away, so that people feel safer and have more space for active travel, for walking, for just chilling out in cities. And it's not all about moving as many cars through cities as we can at a time. So road space reallocation has that sort of double-sided coin thing, where as per the example I used earlier, if you take spaces away from cars and give it to public transport, not only are you making car travel less attractive, but the public transport will work better. It'll be more efficient because there'll be less congestion, so more people will use it. And it continues to work on that cycle. Moving on to the shift there, and Joe Seymour's timing is impeccable in terms of walking in the middle of this. A key element of this is continuing to push and roll out our walking and cycling infrastructure. And the NTA and local authorities are doing incredible work in this area, and we need to keep that going. There is 360 million euro allocated to active travel infrastructure, be it walking or cycling, annually, and we need to keep spending that. And the local authorities and the NTA are really ramping up. We've funded a lot of positions in local authorities to facilitate this. And I believe it's really starting to deliver now. And we need to keep the momentum up there. Publishing the National Cycling Manual, which is design standards for cycleways, I believe that's imminent. And also the department has recently launched a Pathfinder program, which is basically 35 projects, which are sort of exemplar active travel or sustainable mobility or public transport projects that are being rolled out, to demonstrate what can be done and to demonstrate what success looks like. And we need to keep working on those. Then moving on to the other element of shift, which is all around public transport. So there is already a major public transport investment program underway, covering things like Metrolink, Dart Plus, Bus Connects, the Cork Commuter Area Programme, interurban fleet capacity and rail services expansion. So we need to keep that investment there and keep the strategic planning around that ahead of the curve, so that we're planning for the future and planning for a more sustainable transport future. The NTA Connecting Ireland programme, which is about rural bus services, that really needs to be rolled out, and that will connect a huge number of towns and villages that currently aren't connected to a functioning public transport network and system. But we also need to look at our longer term investment planning and operational and current expenditure planning for public transport systems, because public transport isn't just about capital expenditure where we build the infrastructure, but you need to continue to operate it, improve its frequency, improve its coverage. And as we can see, there are lots of issues there in terms of driver shortages and other issues, but we need to make sure that we have security in the funding there into the future, so that we can pay to keep these things running at the level that they need to keep running for people to make the switch. And then the final thing relates to shared and integrated mobility. And this is, well, there are two elements to this. One is shared services, where we're seeing more and more bike pools or car pools, be it Bleeper or Mobi or Tier or Lime or any of these bike rental systems, or any of the corresponding car systems like GoCar, et cetera. We need to get them up and running all over the country so that people have an alternative to ownership. And then secondly, we need to come up with the IT systems that connect them all, so that with one app, you can say, I want to go from here down to Cork. And it'll say, okay, well, there's actually a Bleeper bike out there. You can jump on that, cycle to the train station, or the Lewis, go to Houston, get the train there, whatever, and it'll piece together your journey for you in an IT infrastructure that's completely interoperable. So moving on then, I am conscious of time to improve, and improve is about where people need to continue to use a car. How can we make sure that those cars are as efficient as possible from a carbon perspective? And the first area here is covered by a work program called ZEVI and an office called ZEVI, which is Zero Emission Vehicles Ireland. And there's a whole range of work there, ranging from supports for the purchase of cars. And we all know there are very good government grants to purchase cars, electric PSVs, which are taxis, alternatively fueled heavy duty vehicles, but also putting in place the charging infrastructure so that people know that if they get one of these, they'll be able to charge them. And they don't have range anxiety, they're not concerned about being stranded, that there is sufficient infrastructure to support a full fleet of EVs in Ireland. So we're looking at regional EV network plans, high-powered charging in line with European regulations called alternative fuel infrastructure regulations, or AFIR, and the launch and initial drawdown of destination charger schemes. We saw the announcement today of the sports club schemes. So it's continuing to roll out schemes like that to promote the uptake of electric vehicles. Renewable fuels, we need to develop a national policy framework on alternative fuels. Where I say there, move from E5 to E10, that's our biofuel obligation for this year, where we want our petrol to go from 5% to 10% biofuels and ethanol. And we also need to publish a new policy statement bringing us out to 2025. Also support renewable gas development and the use of biomethane in transport. And there's a whole range of new things in terms of aviation and maritime that we need to look at. And then finally, in terms of public transport, we need to look at improving the sustainability of our school transport scheme. We need to look at developing a decarbonisation strategy for long distance bus services. So we would have done hydrogen trials with Bus Éireann last year. So we need to figure out what is the best way of powering our long distance buses. For short distances, we are looking at electric bus fleet procurement and depot and charging upgrades. So as well as those measures under the avoid, shift, improve categorization, we have special focus on haulage and on climate adaptation. So adapting our networks to deal with the locked in effects of climate change. I'm not going to go into those here, but they're also detailed in the plan. So almost there. Few slides by way of conclusion. First of all, what does all this mean for the engineering sector? And in my view, there's 4 points that I think are really important. First of all, we need to refocus how we approach land use and spatial planning around transport orientated and compact development. This isn't just about spatial planning over here and transport planning over here, and now the two shall meet. They have to be fully integrated, because what we plan and how we plan our services and developments directly impacts how much we need to move. And if we want to move around less, we need to join those thinking processes up. We need to reimagine how we develop and revive our existing urban spaces and public realms so that they're more people focused, they're more accessible, they're more permeable, so that people are happy to move around urban spaces rather than assuming they need to drive everywhere. We need sustained investment in terms of money and resources, designers, contractors, the whole lot, to deliver the major public transport capital infrastructure we need, Metrolink, Dartplus, Bus Connects, etc. And then finally, we also need to keep looking at our road network, and we need to review the demands on the road network and infrastructure of, be it shared spaces and design standards for cycling, but also more bus transit, both intra-urban and inter-urban bus transit, and the impact that will have on our roads, and in particular, heavier vehicles, because every EV is heavier than its corresponding fossil fuel model, which means that the roads that we have are going to have heavier cars using them, with higher torque using them. So that is going to have impacts on how we design and how we continue to maintain our road network. So by way of conclusion, there are very ambitious targets. I'm not going to stand here and say we are definitely going to achieve absolutely everything here. They are, and the terms I've heard used are eye-watering or beyond compare. They are big, and we need to keep chasing them, but knowing that, in some areas they may be missed. but 80% success rate is better than doing nothing at all. It will be difficult to track and monitor this, so we do need to look at the data side of this to make sure that we're tracking how well we're doing and how are we measuring modal share, how are we measuring the total vehicle kilometers driven in any year. So there is a challenge there. The changes we're talking about here will need state investment. They need government policy to drive them forward. They also need private sector initiatives, but coupled with that, we need significant individual behavior change at the level of every citizen in the country. Every person living here will have to do things differently if this is to work. And for that reason, communication will be critical. We'll need to keep talking and communicating and advertising what we're looking to achieve. And I think all of these targets and all of these challenges, I roles in all of these for the engineering sector. I know roads people sometimes say, oh God, we're going to be out of a job here because we're replacing everything with people cycling and moving around by public transport. Not so. I think there's going to be things are going to be different. We're going to have to respond to those changes, but that's really what engineers do best. So, Donald, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that was like you said. I think eye-watering is probably a good keyword to close on that presentation. Yeah, sure. Look at. I think what we do is we might as well just throw it up to the floor first. If there's any particular questions and answers, I know there's a few there on the Zoom platform. But if anybody like to ask a question, if you wouldn't mind, just stand up if you can give me your name. I'll have to repeat the question into the microphone for the online viewers.
On the individual behavior change issue, are you aware of any good surveys that are being done in terms of baseline for behavior and attitudes to transport at the moment? It might be changed. Is there a plan to track the changes in attitude every time? Thank you. Brilliant talk.
So that's with Andrew from cycling.ie asking about are we aware of any are you aware of any particular studies around behavioural change from the cyclist.ie National Advocacy Network for Cycling. Yeah, so just around information around behavioural change for moving towards cycling as a mode of transport.
General transport attitudes.
And general transport attitudes. Okay.
Thanks, Donald. Thanks, Will. There's an awful lot out there. So you have things like the Walking and Cycling Index, which is going to be rolled out to the five cities. It's up to date. Up to recently, it's only been done for Dublin City, but that is going to be rolled out across the whole country. We have the NTA National Household Travel Survey, which gives some insights there, and that's increased the frequency of once per annum. The CSO also run travel surveys, which gives us some information as well. But we are going to be launching a fairly significant or a very significant and sustained advertising campaign around modal shift, and particularly changing shorter journeys to active modes. And as part of that, one of the things we do want to do is run surveys testing behaviors and attitudes of samples of 2,000 to 3,000 people on a 3 or 6 monthly basis. So the first one of those, that's out to tender at the moment, and the tender is due back tomorrow, but the first one of those will be run before the advertising campaign kicks off, and then we'll track the impact that the advertising campaign is having on behaviors and attitudes on a 3 monthly or 6 monthly basis, potentially through focus groups, as well as doing surveys of, as I say, between 2,000 and 3,000 people for each interval. So there is a lot planned in that space, yeah.
Okay, is there anybody else that'd like to ask a question? Mark Coleman.
I have quite a few questions, but I won't ask them all. Number one, you mentioned at the outset you had interdepartmental contact. Was there any contact with environmentals? That's number one. Number two, I don't understand why it is recommendation for EVs. And EVs are just going to bring more traffic onto the road. And okay, you argue that okay, emissions are less, but I haven't heard you talk about, I haven't heard anybody that I heard talk about the awesome effect, which is the effect that cars and trucks and buses have on the friction between cars and the brakes and the particular matter, which is a killer, you know, and you have to mention that, and that's going to be a big result and residue from EV cars. The other thing is this, I'm involved in one way, but we have the indirect traffic research report during the week, or last week, highlighted that Dublin and another city in Ireland, Galway, were in the top 3% of 1,000 countries or cities in 5 continents out of something like 50 countries. Now, I'm involved in a movement which we're advocating in light rail, which has a modal shift of 30%. Proven 30% modal shift. I haven't heard you talk about that, or I haven't seen it anywhere here with on the paper. We think in the area that I'm talking about, that light rail is something that not everyone Cork should have. We didn't mention very Waterford or Galway. Galway is in the top 3% of the most congested cities in the world. You know, it's congested. And we're saying light rail would be very light rail actually would be a big solution, and it's a no-brainer.
Maybe to paraphrase Mark's question, so there was 3 elements to Mark's question.
I don't think EVs are a silver bullet, because I don't think it's going to reduce congestion. It's going to be more and more, and okay, they'll reduce emissions, but they won't. They'll add to a particular battle, which is a silent killer, and that's
Yeah.
You're talking about pollution, you're talking about respiratory diseases and all of that. You haven't talked about that outside. I don't think yourself, John, but the government hasn't talked about that. In fact, we haven't talked about it in Ireland. The only country that happens in Europe that hasn't talked about it. I mean, nobody has heard of the Oslo effect that's out there for 10 years, you know.
Okay, so for the people on Zoom, so there's 3 elements to the question.
Engagement with private enterprises, EVs, and lightweight.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so yeah, exactly. Okay, you go.
Thanks, Bart. So engagement with private enterprises, absolutely, we have. We've engaged, from an electric vehicle perspective. Obviously, we've engaged with industry there, but we're also engaging with, say, for example, bike suppliers and cargo bike suppliers around initiatives there. There's a whole range of stakeholder engagement going on an ongoing basis with both private and public stakeholders. So that does go on an ongoing basis. In relation to EVs, I couldn't agree with you more. And we absolutely are talking about the air quality impacts of EVs and recognizing that they're heavier. The emissions from tires can be more dangerous than for lighter vehicles, and the emissions from brake pads can be more dangerous than for lighter vehicles. So that is one of the key reasons we've moved away from this whole idea of get 1 million EVs on the road and you'll solve the problem, towards more systemic changes where we are trying to reduce car dependencies. So in CAP 21, we had a reduction of car kilometers limited to just fossil fuel cars. This time we said, no, it applies to all cars. Everyone needs to be driving less, regardless of what type of car you drive, regardless of whether it's a fossil fuel vehicle or an electric vehicle, because they don't solve congestion, they don't solve safety issues, they don't solve congestion, they don't solve air quality issues. But having said all that, there is no realistic prospect in the next 7 years, which is our first target of 2030, or even the next 27 years in terms of 2050, of Ireland becoming a car-free country or a car-free society. It isn't going to happen. So what we do need to make sure is that we drive down and reduce the amount that people drive as much as possible, but acknowledge that there will always be a residual car fleet. And what we do want to do is make that car fleet as efficient as possible from a carbon emissions perspective, which is why the EV element of it has to still be part of the plan. The other thing that I would say, and I showed a graph there, is that in order to meet our emission reduction by 2030 of 50%, all the other measures put together don't have the same impact that the transition to EVs will have, which means it has to be, particularly in the short term, part of the solution. But for me, the bigger transformative change that we're talking about and that we need to stay focused on is reduce our car dependency, reduce a car-centric system that locks people in to having to drive everywhere. And I think that leads us on to the third question you asked about light rail, and are we looking at that in individual cities around the country and not just Dublin? Yes, we are. I mean, the transportation strategies that I spoke about under the avoid piece does look at what the best long-term solutions are, particularly in our cities, for moving people around. And they'll continue to be updated on a 5-year basis, and we'll continue to ask those questions about what is the best way to move people around. Is it buses? Is it active travel? Do we need to look at new systems like light rail systems, which would be considered in Cork, for example, and continue to be considered in other areas around the country and other cities around the country? So I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but I do think that EVs in the short term do have a part to play. Because if people continue to keep buying fossil fuel cars, we'll still have the other issues that EVs will give us, but we'll also be failing to meet our climate targets. So at least let's focus on the cars that need to stay on the road at transitioning them to EVs rather than leaving them as ICE vehicles.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Car parking. You mentioned car parking is a very clear relationship to privacy. I think my own company is a private company and Grant has got 300 people, far too much car parking and a lot of divided. Is there a proposal to somehow restrict car parking in the city centre, perhaps the first place?
Yeah, so the question is, have we identified ways of restricting car parking? And I would absolutely agree with you that providing car parking incentivizes car use. And therefore, if you take it away, you disincentivize car use. And the Climate Action Plan does talk about car parking in terms of the public sector, that the provision of free car parking for public sector employees should be done away with, which I think is a starting point in the right direction. It leads by example. It talks about free parking levies, and it also talks about introducing increased parking charges, and that would be assessed as part of the overall demand management strategy. I mean, it's one of a number of different fiscal tools or measures that you can look at in trying to disincentivize car use, but we are committing to looking at car parking in particular. And we're not the only department that are. So, for example, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, in terms of their sustainable and compact settlement guidelines, are looking at car park limits and, setting limits on how much car parking can be provided for certain new developments. And I know that Fingal, for example, have implemented limits on car parking for certain new in terms of their development planning and so on. So it is key, it's recognized as key, and it is addressed in the plan.
Great. One more, yeah, please.
Would that be all that's at a national level that we're going to achieve our 20%? Because that slide, the 20% reduction is 20% from 2018 baseline, not business as usual to 2030, isn't it? It's 20% below, and that's why I think the 2023 cap is better than the 2021 in that it does cut across all the vehicles, not just this, because I think in 2021 everyone thought the EVs were going to solve everything. They're not, because it's keeping. Is that national demand management strategy that's come from? Is that actually going to contain what you call up there as? Is it going to contain for the cities the level of parking per city? Or is it going to let it do a whole suite of things that we all know will work? Or is it actually going to put into law the things that actually need to be done? Because to take more car parking space out of any city when it's both by the councillors is hard to do, and I'm talking 1, 2, and we actually need to be cutting it by 50% possibly.
Yeah. So the National Demand Management Strategy will set out a framework, and then individual cities will implement that as per their own city. So, it may set out guidelines or targets in terms of reduction of car parks, and then a local city's demand management scheme for that city, we'll say, okay, this is how we're going to apply that. But it certainly will look at that whole range of measures, from congestion charging to parking restrictions to road user charging, to a whole range of things that need to be considered. Everything is on the table, and they all have to be considered at a national basis. And then that framework will inform the development of demand management schemes for each of the individual cities, primarily as part of the metropolitan area transportation strategies. So, for example, the GDA, which published the transportation strategy 2 weeks ago or whatever it was, they're now on foot of that, developing a demand management scheme for Dublin City. But this new demand management strategy at a national level will inform the development of local city demand management schemes.
Okay, maybe would we try and take a question online, or is there you? Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, thank you.
We have about 24 questions I'm trying to compress from about 250 people online.
Right.
So I'll just fire them quickly at you here. So a question that came, there was 2 questions related to the modelling that was done. NRN presumably is National Road Network. Yes. And then there was a follow-on question from someone else. Is it intended to model the rest of the network to understand the effect of speed limit reduction across the whole road network?
Mm-hmm. I'm not as close to others on the modelling around the speed limit enforcement, so I'm not in a position to talk to that in detail. But anything you do on the national road network, if you're not careful, you create displacement effects. So what you can do is someone who's limited in speed on a dual carriageway will say, well, sure, I'm going to take a side road because I can go faster there. So any modelling will look at the full impacts on the overall national road network, rather than just focusing exclusively on the national road network and ignoring the potential for displacement effects.
Okay, we had 3 or 4 people ask the question about the embedded carbon that's on these major improvement schemes, metro, port works, all of that. Is that considered in this modelling, the carbon effects of actually building the improvements necessary to achieve the overall network benefits?
So in terms of the transport modelling, we just look at tailpipe emissions and the emissions from, say, buses, or the emissions from diesel trains or whatever. Our figures do not capture the construction emissions, but they are captured in other areas of the economy. So the overall climate action plan, which is a whole of economy plan, does consider them in one of the other sectors. And to be honest, that it depends on exactly what the project is, but they're not explicitly modelled or included in our emissions model, no.
Okay. Your view on hydro-treated vegetable oil as a drop-in replacement for diesel fuel?
I know that it is being used quite a lot, and PUST have done quite a lot of piloting on it. And I know there are views about the impact on engines. I'm not a mechanical engineer, so I'm going on what I've heard from other people, but I know that the consideration of biofuels from a national strategic perspective is safer than looking at HVO, but it is certainly one of the options we need to continue to consider and look at in terms of its potential. I wouldn't write it off by any means.
Okay, there's a lot of compliments here. Some criticisms about how ambitious the plan is. There was a question raised about if it's a statutory target. It is a statutory target, so presumably there will be a lot of pressure to hit it. Is there fines if we don't?
Yes, there will be fines if we don't. Or I mean, the law is domestic law; it's not international law. So we have set our own targets. So it's not a international or EU fine, but there are costs of compliance associated with this if we don't meet targets, which are also set at a European level. So yeah, there are costs to the exchequer of not meeting this. Yes.
Question about changes to concessionary tickets for school transport. In West Cork, apparently there's very high demand for bus routes, but bus tenders will only be sized based on certain criteria rather than all children along the route. Is that a policy being looked at?
So the school bus system is actually not dealt with by the Department of Transport, it's Department of Education, but we work closely with them. And I mean, ultimately what we want to do is deliver a system that takes as many cars off the road in escorting kids to schools. So if we identify clear solutions there and can unblock that as a means to getting more kids on buses, that's what we're working with the Department of Education on.
This question.
I feel like I'm on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
Yeah, I tried to. If behavioural change is so important, how come most rural county active travel teams only have engineers and technicians or admin personnel, no communication specialists?
That's a very, very good question. And we're looking at the moment at enhancing the communications capacity around the country to promote active travel and to promote buy-in for active travel infrastructure projects, so that we're working very closely with the NRA to try and enhance the project acceptance through communications. But that's work in train. So it's ongoing work, but it's a very valid point and it's something we're looking to address, yeah.
Liam Desmond has a good question here now, as someone who cycled about 20 kilometres already today. With a view to combating an embedded car dependency compounded by free parking, Ireland should allow employer tax-free incentives to employees to cycle to work, and he's suggesting 25 cents a kilometre, so you can bump that a bit, to drive behavioural change. This is practiced in Holland, Belgium and France with great success. Not included in CAP 23. Was there consideration given to it, or is there consideration given to it?
So it's not explicitly referenced in CAP 23. It is something we would explicitly look at in terms of our pre-budget negotiations with the Department of DPER, or Department of Public Expenditure and Reform and Finance, in terms of what taxation systems we can use, not only to disincentivize car use, but to promote and incentivize active travel, be it things like grants for e-bikes, the Bike to Work scheme, which has been successful but has limitations, and also looking at sort of pay to cycle schemes like you're referring to there.
Okay, one question, this should be quick. The transport modelling report, is it available on a website someplace someone can find it?
It's available on the NTA website, yeah, and we can circulate the link to that. So far, just the summary is available, but the full detailed 250-page modelling report should be up there within the next 4 weeks. And it'll take someone about the same length of time to read it.
Okay, 3 more and then I'll stop. Okay, is aviation the elephant in the room? Airports have been identified as one of the largest sources. They're dependent on car access, etc. What consideration is given to that, or is that covered by other sectors?
So there's 3 different things in that question. One is international aviation and the emissions associated with that. That isn't covered by the Climate Action Plan, but is covered by international decarbonisation targets and European targets and so on. Secondly, in terms of the emissions from airports themselves, they are covered by the public sector mandate to try and reduce emissions at a public sector basis. And in terms of the third thing, cars accessing airports, that falls under this, and looking at ways to look at people shifting their mode from cars to public transport to access airports. Yeah.
Okay. Rita Ryan was wondering if there were any programs or apps that could connect people who commute to the same school, so they could car share or walk together, cycle together. Some of this may happen naturally, but if there was a safe platform to connect people, it may increase the use of active travel and car share.
I'm not aware of any specific system that has been set up for that. I know of systems like the Galway cycle bus, for example, that has grown organically, but I'm not aware of any online or app-based system that facilitates that.
Good idea, though. Yeah. And then last question is, how does CAP 23 compare with our European counterparts, and which country is leading the charge?
I think we're up there. We set ourselves very ambitious targets. They would be in line with the EU targets. In fact, probably more ambitious than the EU targets. But every single European country has similar challenges, because even countries like Holland, where obviously the modal share of cycling is huge, they still have a huge car ownership culture. Okay, we're probably more car dependent than others. But in terms of the level of ambition we've set out in CAP, I think it would be comparable with other European countries.
Many thanks for that. That's great. Okay, but I think we'll probably draw the event to a close.